15 of the world's most terrifying serial killers who were never caught. Part 1.
If you are brand new to our channel, we invite you to take a moment to subscribe. Just click on the lit red button as well as the gray bell. Why the bell? Well, it will let you know every time we post a new video.
1. USA. You have probably heard a lot about police brutality in the USA, particularly in very recent times. This has become a major problem in the country, particularly since 9/11. The changes brought in around that time allowed police officers to act almost with impunity, shooting to kill even on the slightest sliver of doubt that a suspect may become violent. There have been plenty of controversial shootings, as well as deaths in police custody, which have triggered riots and widespread condemnation. Some recent cases of note have included the fatal shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson in 2014, Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, and Gregory Gunn. The killings have resulted in nationwide protests. The Black Lives Matter movement hasn't been shy about the thought that much of the police violence is racially motivated. Even prior to 9/11, there were many recorded cases of police brutality, but the situation has continued to worsen over time. 2. South Africa. Figures suggest that more people were killed by police in South Africa in 2015 than in 2014, a statistic that prompted outcry in the country. Not only deaths, but also other incidences of police brutality were recorded as rising. These included tortures and rapes carried out by uniformed officers. It has become such a problem that the civil liability suits brought against the police force would be enough to wipe out their budget if all were upheld. There were 244 deaths in police custody in 2015, as well as 124 rape cases involving officers. 42 of those were on duty at the time of the attacks. There were 145 cases of police torture, almost a 50% increase on the year before. Protesters are also regularly faced with techniques such as the firing of rubber bullets. It's clear that there is a problem with police brutality, a trend that has continued. 3. Egypt. In 2004, a CIA officer called Robert Baer claimed that Egypt was the place to send a man if you wanted them to disappear from the face of the earth. Then the Arab Spring happened and things only got worse. Police brutality has skyrocketed and shows no signs of ever slowing down. In 2015, the statistics were horrendous. 1,250 people were forced to disappear, 267 were killed by the police force with no investigation or trial, and 40,000 people were remanded as political prisoners. These numbers were put together by human rights groups, and it's thought that the true figures could be even higher. The Nadim Center documented more than 600 local cases of torture during the same year. As a result, the center was put under investigation for receiving foreign funding without authorization. Unfortunately, no solution has so far been found to stop the police brutality, particularly since the current government is of the opinion that the ousted Mubarak allowed all of this to begin because he was too lenient in allowing protests and opposition to his rule. 4. Somalia. The Somalian police force is known as one of the most corrupt in the world. The country has been torn apart by war, and wounds are not allowed to heal as police enjoy free rein to act as they wish. The police force are for the most part ineffective, most of them accepting bribes to look the other way when crimes are committed. They are hugely underpaid, and as a result see citizens as a source of wages. They are not above stealing during searches as well as harassing innocent citizens for money. Police brutality is rampant. As if this was not enough, around 1,000 Somali officers suddenly disappeared in 2009 after they were given training provided by the German government. These officers are thought to have run off to join an Islamist militia. While efforts have been made to clean it up, the force is still as corrupt and violent as it has ever been, making it one of the least safe places for citizens. 5. Russia. In Russia, police violence is so common that it is barely even reported. So say the comments from Russian citizens themselves, where it is expected that the police will use brutal force whenever they feel like it. Conditions inside prisons are particularly bad. One case which hit headlines recently was that of Sergei Pestrov, who had been a drummer in a moderately successful band in the 1970s. In September 2015, he was drumming in his garage near Moscow when police burst in to arrest him. Police began hitting him soon after they entered the garage, said Ekaterina Shcherbina, one of his fellow musicians in the garage. One of the officers punched him on the back of the head, and blood immediately began to pour from his nose. He was then tied up with his own belt and remanded in police custody on suspicion of dealing drugs. The next morning, his wife had to identify his lifeless body in a hospital bed. The police say they released him in the middle of the night, and he was already unwell when he returned. Human rights protesters obviously believe differently. 6. Kenya. Kenyan police came under heavy criticism, not for the first time, in May 2016 for their clashes with citizens. During protests, they turned with brutal force on anyone who stood out of line. One journalist described what he had seen. A man was chased across the street and fell down. As he lay motionless on the ground, the riot policeman who had pursued him beat him with a stick, breaking it in half, and then continued to kick him half a dozen times, while 2 other police joined in. He added, police went through the streets and alleys chasing protesters, beating them with sticks and clubs. In a nearby building where both protesters and bystanders had taken refuge, police went into the building, flushing them out towards waiting colleagues who beat many with wooden clubs and kicked them as they tried to flee. The protests were over corruption in the government, and it's easy to see why people felt it necessary to take to the streets, even at the risk of their lives, because of the widespread difficulties in the country. 7. Haiti. Brutality in Haiti is commonplace, and this decade has seen more than its fair share of massacres and incidents that would have caused widespread outrage in any first-world country. Let's take one example to illustrate the problem as a whole. The island of Isle of Vache was taken over by government officials who wished to turn it into more of an attraction. Rather than going through proper procedures or even informing citizens, they simply began bulldozing homes. When the residents began organizing peaceful marches and demanding answers, a new police chief was swapped in to make them keep quiet. People were violently beaten, 17 recorded in just 1 month, when a human rights organization headed over there to talk to them. They were hit with clubs, stomped on with heavy boots, and kicked, whether man, woman, or pastor. The residents reported ongoing health problems such as loss of hearing or hemorrhaging since the violence. Higher-placed protesters, such as members of the local police force, were simply arrested and removed from the community. 8. Iran. To understand the level of police violence in Iran, you must take a look at the Ashura protests of 2009 first. These took place on the day of Ashura, a holy day when violence is forbidden and justice is upheld. The protests were met with violence, with security forces even opening fire on the protesters. Plainclothes officers shot directly at protesters and aimed to kill, while trucks were driven over them to keep them down. This was repeated constantly during protests over the election. The police used batons, sticks, pepper spray, and firearms to subdue riots and peaceful protests alike. The government says that there were officially 36 deaths during the protests, but opposition supporters claim that the number is much higher. In 2015, the country hosted a conference on police brutality against black people in the USA, prompting outrage from those who know the truth about the country's police force.